Welcome. I'm excited to talk to you this week about inclusive practices. When we hear words like inclusion or inclusive practices and differentiated and individualized learning, those are kind of buzzwords that people use all the time, but there really couldn't be anything more important. If you remember a bit of my background, I've focused in my life on both gifted education, so students that have, typically we're talking about a very high IQ, they might be in the top 3 to 5% of children in terms of their memory, their vocabulary, their speed at which they're learning things, and things like of that nature. And then students with disabilities, that could be intellectual disabilities, things like ADHD, autism spectrum, all of those different types of disabilities as well. And if we look at all the students that aren't what we call average, and we don't differentiate, we have to think about, let's say there's 15 children in your class. If I'm teaching one lesson, if I'm lucky, I might be reaching 7 to 10 of my 15 students. Well, what happens to the 3 or 5 or 7 students that I'm not reaching? Well, a lot of not good things. And our job is, of course, to help each child grow and develop both academically and socially throughout their time with us. So that's where we have to start thinking about where are they at academically, where are they at socially, and how can I be that scaffolder, that support for them as they're going through this. We read a little bit about Vygotsky as well. Remember, we're looking for that zone of proximal development, which is what can students do with our support. If they can do it easily on their own, or if they can't do it even with our support, then we're not reaching them at the appropriate level for where they're at. So inclusive practices, you're going to do 2 different activities this week that are tied to this. One is that you're going to develop a lesson plan. When you're doing your lesson plan, we'll look through that in a bit, but you want to think about how can I make it more or less challenging based on students' individual needs in my class. When I'm doing lessons and activities in my classroom, they need to be differentiated, meaning we need to think about what's the main thing I want them to teach, but then how can I maybe make it more or less challenging, offer more support or less support, and developmentally appropriate. So for instance, a child might be a very high reader. Let's say they're 5 years old and they're reading 3rd or 4th grade level chapter books. However, it wouldn't be developmentally appropriate for them to read 4th or 5th grade level content at times. So I'm looking for books that are at their level, so it's differentiated for their reading need, but are also developmentally appropriate. So I'm not going to have a 5-year-old reading about, a dating scenario in a book, for instance. So developmentally appropriate has 1 to do with their age and all their needs, but then 2, recognizing that there are big differences, especially for our little ones. Some children might just be learning their ABCs while others are reading. It is our ethical and sometimes legal responsibility as well. So as you're moving through the school system also, we have IEPs or individual education plans for students identified with disabilities. We have some different plans legally that are enacted for students related to reading skill levels and if they are struggling. We have advanced learning plans for students that are identified as gifted as well. Those are all parts of their needs, and we need to meet them. This includes both those students' academic needs and then also always their social and emotional needs. And the younger students are, and frankly I believe for all students, the base should be their social and emotional needs, but certainly when we're talking about little ones. But those 2 things aren't mutually exclusive. So certainly a student's academic needs, and if they're not being met, will start impacting their social and emotional. For instance, if I'm very, very bored in class all the time, I'm going to start acting out. So then it might look like a social struggle, but actually it's coming from an academic need. So we need to think about all those different possibilities. When we look at advanced learning plans and such for students within gifted education in public schools, for instance, we're writing goals that are both academic and social for them. Now, without differentiation and more inclusive practices, lots of bad things start occurring. These students are at risk for and often will act out. They'll have behavioral issues. Older students are more likely to get into trouble, drop out, get into trouble in general. They may become unmotivated. They might just really hate school. And of course, my goodness, we want them to love school and love being with us. Let me show you a little bit of detail on your class assignments for this week. One of your two major assignments is going to be to create a lesson plan. So think about something maybe that you'd like to teach that you haven't yet. A couple of you are not in schools. You're making it as though you are, or you might have fun with it and then try it out with your own children or children you're working with. Many of you are in schools. So within the resources this week, there's a lesson plan template. I'd like you to use that. You're filling out, basic information. This doesn't have to be a ton of detail, but what are the materials that you need? What is the objective? So not just, we're reading about butterflies. What do you want them to learn? Say it in language that children and parents can understand as well. It's important to let them know why it is that you're teaching them this. And then we always want to be thinking about the standards. So we did in your midterm as well, that was one of the questions, what are some standards? I'd like you to look at the Colorado State standards, and you can click on the link or you can type it in to look at preschool standards. Pick a couple. They have areas within physical education. Sometimes it talks about social and emotional needs as well, but things like reading, writing, math, all of those things. Pick a couple standards that you're wanting to tie to what you'd like them to learn. And then a basic lesson outline could just be, what do you want to have happen at the beginning, the middle, and the end. This is a total of 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, right? Maybe even a little less for our little ones. You want to think about maybe a little bit of time where you're telling them about what you're going to do or reading a book. The beginning should have a hook. What's going to get them excited about what you're going to do? And then what's the middle? That might be sometimes I'm going to do it, and then we're going to do, let's say, a craft or activity, and then they do it. So I do, we do, you do. Maybe by the end, they're working on a special project on their own. The other two things that you need to fill out for sure, one is differentiation. We were just talking about this. So what are the ideas? And you could just put a little plus and a little minus, or write for more challenge or less challenge. What are you wanting to give to these students so that their needs are being met? And think about some of the other challenges. Could be students that maybe struggle with fine motor skills and you're having them do a craft, or with attention, and you want to make sure that they have enough breaks and wiggle room and so on to stay focused. So think about ways that you can differentiate to make it more or less challenging. And then how are you going to assess and know that they learned what you were trying to teach them? For older students, sometimes we do exit tickets. For if you've heard of a KWL chart, that can be a great way to do a beginning, middle, and end of a lesson. The K stands for what do students already know. So when you're starting a new lesson or activity, you could talk to them about, hey, what do you already know about butterflies? Okay. And then the W is what you want to know. So you want to make sure that the students' questions are answered during your lesson. And then the L is at the end. So maybe you go back to circle and say, hey, each of you tell me one thing that you learned about butterflies, right? Or maybe the assessment is their product or their project that they did at the end. So that is what that activity is for this next week. And then the other activity is coming up next. So I'm wanting you to dig into resources and activities, resources and tools that are available for all of your children. So sometimes they may not be officially identified as having ADHD or being gifted or having autism spectrum or having a speech and language disability. They might not be officially identified, and it's not our job to identify them, but we can say this child struggles with, let's say, social skills, or this child struggles with sitting still. And so we can look up tools and resources on the internet and in our neighborhood, and good books as well related to each of these areas. It is your weekly assignment number 4, although it says weekly assignment 5 here. What I would like you to do is you're going to just list, right? So for giftedness, and again, we're talking about gifted and talented, that definition, what's one resource, what's a second resource, and what's a third resource. So you're looking at books and online websites and so on there. And then you're going to pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 disability types. So giftedness and then 5 different disabilities, a total of 6, where you're listing 3 resources for each. That is all. There's so many great resources on the web now. I will make that a part of your discussion as well, where you can add resources and share with one another. And that concludes my overview for this week. I look forward to sharing another week with you.